Kyoto, Japan, 1702. A young samurai stands at a crossroads paralyzed, not by enemies, not by danger, by a simple decision, which path to take to his master's estate. He's been standing there for 20 minutes, weighing options, calculating possibilities, imagining outcomes. Meanwhile, Yamamoto, Tsunetomo, the legendary samurai who would write the Hagakure, made decisions in seconds and never looked back. Over 40 years of service, thousands of life or death choices, zero hesitation. How? Here's what nobody tells you. Self-doubt doesn't come from lack of knowledge. It comes from what the samurai called living between two deaths. And once you understand what that means, you'll never hesitate the same way again. Kenji was 28 years old when he realized he'd spent the last decade preparing for a life he was too afraid to live. He had 2 master's degrees, spoke 3 languages, read over 200 books on entrepreneurship, psychology, and personal development. Could quote Aurelius, Seneca, and Miyamoto Musashi from memory. And he was working as a junior analyst at a consulting firm, making presentations for other people's ideas, going home every night to an apartment that felt more like a waiting room than a home. Every Sunday evening, he'd open his laptop and stare at the business plan he'd been refining for 3 years. A language learning app that combined neuroscience with cultural immersion. He'd validated the market, interviewed potential customers, built financial projections. Everything was ready, except him. The doubt always crept in around slide 23 of the business plan. What if the market shifts? What if I can't raise funding? What if I hire the wrong people? What if I fail and everyone knows? The questions multiplied like bacteria, each one spawning 3 more, until the weight of uncertainty pushed him to close the laptop and watch Netflix until his mind went numb. His girlfriend, Sarah, had stopped asking about the business. Not because she didn't care, but because she'd learned that asking triggered a 30-minute monologue of why the timing wasn't right. His parents had stopped taking his entrepreneurial ambitions seriously. His friends made jokes about his someday plans. And the worst part, he couldn't even argue with them, because they were right. He was all research, no action. All preparation, no execution. All intention, no reality. What Kenji didn't understand yet was that his self-doubt wasn't a personality flaw. It was a psychological pattern, a survival mechanism gone rogue. And there was an ancient Japanese technique hidden in the Hagakure that destroys this pattern at its root. The turning point came on a Wednesday morning in October. Kenji's company was sending him to Tokyo for a 2-week consulting project. He'd been there once before on vacation, did all the tourist things. But this time, during a free weekend, he decided to visit Saga Prefecture, the birthplace of Yamamoto Tsunetomo, the samurai who wrote the Hagakure. There was a small museum dedicated to Tsunetomo's legacy. Kenji expected artifacts, historical displays, maybe some samurai swords. What he found was an old man, probably in his 70s, sitting in the garden behind the museum, practicing calligraphy with movements so precise they looked choreographed. The man looked up, saw Kenji watching, and gestured for him to sit. His name was Takeshi. He'd been the curator of the museum for 40 years, had studied the Hagakure his entire adult life. They talked for 3 hours. Well, Takeshi talked. Kenji mostly listened, occasionally asking questions that seemed to amuse the old man. At one point, Kenji mentioned his business idea, framing it casually, like a hypothetical. Takeshi listened, nodding occasionally. When Kenji finished, Takeshi asked a simple question. "How long have you been thinking about this?" "About 3 years, Kenji admitted. "And how long will you keep thinking before you act?" Kenji started to explain the complexity, the variables, the need for perfect timing. Takeshi held up a hand, gentle but firm. "Yamamoto, Tsunetomo wrote about men like you. He called them the living dead. Not because they had died, but because they were too afraid to live." The words landed like a slap. Kenji felt his face flush. "In the Hagakure," Takeshi continued, "Tsunetomo explains that the samurai lives between 2 deaths. Metaphorical death, where you kill your attachment to outcome and ego, and literal death, which could come at any moment. When you accept both deaths, hesitation becomes impossible. Kenji didn't understand. Takeshi could see it in his face. "Let me ask you something," the old man said. "Why do you doubt?" "Because the first don't know if I'll succeed," Kenji answered immediately. "No," Takeshi said. "You doubt because you're afraid of being embarrassed. Afraid of losing money. Afraid of what people will think if you fail. You doubt because you're alive between life and death. But you've accepted neither, so you're paralyzed." Kenji sat with that, feeling the truth of it settle uncomfortably in his chest. "Tsunetomo taught a technique," Takeshi said. "It has 3 movements, like calligraphy. Each stroke must be complete before the next begins. Do you want to learn it?" Kenji nodded. "The first movement is called Shishin o Suteru. It means, abandon the 4 hearts. The 4 hearts are the heart that seeks comfort, the heart that fears pain, the heart that craves approval, and the heart that avoids shame. These 4 hearts create all self-doubt." Takeshi stood, walked to his calligraphy table, and wrote the characters. His brush moved without hesitation, each stroke confident and final. "Watch how I write," he said. "I do not pause mid-stroke to wonder if the line is perfect. I do not lift the brush to compare my work to a master's. I complete the stroke, then I move to the next. This is how the samurai made decisions: complete the action, then move to the next." He turned to Kenji. "Your doubt comes from trying to know the future, but the future is unknowable. So you gather more information, make more plans, refine more details. But no amount of preparation will eliminate uncertainty." The samurai understood this. So instead of trying to eliminate uncertainty, they eliminated their attachment to outcome. "How?" Kenji asked. "By accepting the worst possible result before taking action," Takeshi explained. Tsunetomo wrote, "Meditation on inevitable death should be performed daily. Picture yourself shot by arrows, guns, spears, burned by fire, struck by lightning, shaken by earthquakes, falling from a cliff, dying of disease, committing seppuku after being shamed. Imagine every possible death every day. When you constantly live with death, then you can achieve freedom in the way." "That sounds morbid," Kenji said. "To a Western mind, yes," Takeshi agreed. But the samurai weren't being morbid. They were being practical. If you meditate on the worst outcome and accept it fully, then you are free to act, because you've already died in your mind. What is there left to fear? Kenji thought about his business. What was the worst outcome? He'd lose his savings, about 40,000. He'd have to explain to his parents why he failed. He'd feel humiliated. He'd have to get another corporate job. And then, he'd survive. That was the worst case. He'd survive. The second movement, Takeshi continued, is Ketsuden Ryoku, decisive action. Once you've abandoned the 4 hearts and accepted the worst outcome, you act immediately. Not when conditions are perfect. Not when you have more information. Immediately. Takeshi picked up his brush again and made a single swift stroke. Indecision is not caused by lack of information, it's caused by lack of commitment. The samurai committed to the decision first, then executed. Most people try to execute first, then commit. This is backwards. He looked directly at Kenji. You have been trying to make a perfect plan so that you feel certain enough to commit. But certainty doesn't come from planning, it comes from commitment. Once you commit, the path reveals itself. Kenji felt something shift in his chest, like a knot loosening. The third movement is Jiken Jiko, constant correction. The samurai didn't expect to make perfect decisions. They expected to make immediate decisions and then correct course as new information emerged. A sword fight doesn't pause. While you reconsider strategy, you strike, you adjust, you strike again. Takeshi drew a circle, his brush moving in one continuous motion. This is the samurai way. Abandon attachment. Decide immediately, correct constantly. Most people do the opposite. They cling to outcomes. They delay decisions. They refuse to adjust. This is why they live in doubt. He set the brush down. Tsunetomo spent the last years of his life as a monk, recording these lessons for future samurai. But his teachings weren't just for warriors. They were for anyone who wanted to live decisively in an uncertain world. Kenji returned to his hotel that night and couldn't sleep. Every excuse he'd been telling himself for 3 years suddenly looked transparent. He wasn't waiting for the right time. He was waiting for guaranteed success. And guaranteed success doesn't exist. At 2 a.m. he opened his laptop and wrote an email to his boss. 2 weeks notice. Professional, respectful, final. He didn't reread it 5 times. He didn't save it as a draft. He hit send. And then, for the first time in years, he felt the knot in his chest completely dissolve. The next morning he woke up terrified. The email had been sent. There was no taking it back. He'd just destroyed his stable income, his predictable life, his safe path. And underneath the terror was something else. Relief, clarity, energy. He spent the rest of his Tokyo trip not sightseeing, but building. Not planning, building. He hired a developer on Upwork to create the first prototype of the app. Not perfect, just functional. He recorded introductory videos for the first 3 language courses. Not professional quality, just clear enough to be useful. He set up a basic website and pre-sale page. Not beautiful, just operational. Every time doubt crept in, he remembered Takeshi's brushstrokes. Complete the action. Move to the next. Don't pause mid-stroke. When he returned to his home country, reality hit. His parents were horrified. His girlfriend was supportive but clearly worried. His friends were skeptical. And the app, in its first version, was objectively mediocre. Clunky interface, limited content, barely functional payment system. The old Kenji would have seen this as confirmation that he'd made a mistake. He would have spiraled into regret, second-guessing, what-ifs. But he'd learned the third movement. Constant correction. The interface was clunky. He found a better designer on a freelance platform and improved it in a week. The content was limited. He recorded 10 new lessons and scheduled 30 more. The payment system was broken. He switched to a more reliable platform in 2 days. Each problem wasn't evidence of failure. It was information for the next correction. And with each correction, the app got better. Not perfect, better. 3 months after launch, he had 47 paying users. Not life-changing, but 47 people who didn't exist in the business plan he'd been refining for 3 years. 47 real humans paying real money for something he built. 6 months in, he had 340 users. The app was still far from perfect, but it was improving every week based on user feedback. And something unexpected happened. He stopped caring about what his parents thought. Not in a rebellious way. He just realized their approval or disapproval had no bearing on whether the app worked or didn't work. Their opinions were outside his control. The quality of his product was inside his control. Sarah broke up with him around month 7. She wanted stability, marriage, a predictable future. He couldn't offer that anymore. It hurt, but not the way he expected. Because he realized he'd been seeking her approval for his choices. And seeking approval is one of the 4 hearts that create doubt. By the end of the first year, Kenji's app had 2,000 users and was generating enough revenue to cover his modest living expenses. Not wealth, not success by conventional standards, but complete freedom from self-doubt. Because he'd internalized the technique, abandoned the 4 hearts, decide immediately, correct constantly. He'd stopped asking, what if I fail? And started asking, what can I learn from this? He'd stopped waiting for certainty and started creating it through action. He'd stopped living between 2 deaths and started living fully in the present. 2 years later, the app had 15,000 users and had been acquired by a larger education company. The acquisition wasn't huge, but it was enough to validate the concept and provide seed funding for his next project. More importantly, Kenji had become someone different. Not someone who never felt doubt, but someone who acted despite it. He returned to Japan to thank Takeshi. The old man was still in the museum garden, practicing calligraphy with the same precise movements. "You came back," Takeshi said, not looking up from his work. "I wanted to thank you," Kenji said. "The technique changed my life." "I didn't give you a technique," Takeshi replied, completing a stroke. I pointed at what you already knew but were afraid to accept, which was, that certainty is an illusion, and waiting for it is a form of death. Takeshi looked up, smiled. Tsunetomo wrote that the way of the samurai is found in death. Not literal death. Not literal death. The death of the ego that needs to be right, needs to be safe, needs to be approved. When that ego dies, you're free to act. Kenji nodded. He understood now in a way he hadn't 2 years ago. There's a young man who visits the museum sometimes, Takeshi said. Smart, educated, full of ideas, but afraid to start. Reminds me of someone. He smiled knowingly. Maybe next time he comes, you can share what you learned. 3 years later, Kenji teaches a workshop called the Samurai Decision Method. It's not about Japanese culture or martial arts. It's about the psychology of decisive action in the face of uncertainty. He teaches the 3 movements: abandon the 4 hearts, comfort seeking, pain avoidance, approval craving, shame fearing. Decide immediately. Commit to the decision, then execute, not the reverse. Correct constantly. Treat outcomes as information, not as judgment. Last month, a woman in her 30s approached him after a workshop. I've been trying to leave my corporate job and start a coaching practice for 2 years, she said. But the first can't get past the fear that I'll fail. What's the worst outcome if you fail? Kenji asked. She listed them: lost income, damaged reputation, judgment from family, having to go back to corporate work. And if all of that happens, will you survive? He asked. She paused. Yes. Then you've already accepted the worst outcome. So what's stopping you? She thought about it. Nothing, I guess. Just habit. Tsunetomo would say you're living between 2 deaths. The death of your corporate identity and the birth of your coaching identity. And you're stuck in between, which is the only place where real death occurs. Not physical death, soul death, the death of potential. 2 weeks later, she sent him a message. I gave my notice today. Terrified but alive. Thank you. That's the pattern, Kenji sees over and over. Intelligent, capable people paralyzed not by lack of ability, but by inability to act without certainty. And the moment they understand that certainty is an illusion they've been waiting for, they become unstoppable. The technique Yamamoto Tsunetomo taught isn't magic, it's brutally practical. It doesn't eliminate fear or doubt. It eliminates the habit of letting fear and doubt control your actions. You still feel the fear, but you act anyway. You still experience doubt, but you decide anyway. And with each decision, each action, each course correction, you become someone who trusts yourself not because you're always right, but because you know you can handle being wrong. Now, let me ask you something. You've watched this far. That means you're struggling with a decision. Maybe it's a career change. Maybe it's a relationship. Maybe it's a creative project you've been putting off. You know what you want to do, but you're waiting for something. Certainty, permission, the perfect moment. And that waiting is killing you slowly. Here's your challenge. Practice the first movement. Abandon the 4 hearts. Write down the decision you've been avoiding. Then write down the 4 fears. What comfort would you lose? What pain might you experience? Whose approval might you lose? What shame might you feel? Now ask yourself, if all 4 of those outcomes happened, would you survive? Be honest. Because if the answer is yes, then you've just eliminated the only real barrier to action. Everything else is just noise. The samurai didn't wait for perfect conditions. They accepted death, then lived fully. You don't have to face physical death, but you do have to face the death of the identity that needs certainty before action. Comment below the decision you're committing to this week, not the decision you're thinking about. The decision you're committing to. Because the moment you write it publicly, you've taken the first stroke. And once the first stroke is complete, the second becomes inevitable. Yamamoto Tsunetomo lived 300 years ago, but his teaching destroys self-doubt today, the same way it destroyed hesitation then, not by eliminating uncertainty, by eliminating your attachment to needing certainty before you act. The question is simple. Will you keep living between two deaths? Or will you choose one? Accept it fully and finally start living. Choose. Then act. Then correct. Repeat until you die. That's the way.